the very bottom of Yud Zayin Amud Beis. We're starting Yud Ches. The Gemara was in the middle of discussing the sequence of the blessings of the Shemona Esrei, the 19 blessings of Shemona Esrei. We got up to Yerushalayim. So we have extra Gemaras here. So the Gemara had talked about how the tzaddikim, the righteous, are a precursor towards Yerushalayim, and that's why the bracha of Yerushalayim Ircha comes after the bracha of Ala Tzaddikim. And then we're up to the last 6 words of the DAF on Yud Zayin Amud Beis. V'keven shenivnes Yerushalayim ba David. That once Jerusalem is built, that's when the Davidic leader, the David leader, the Messiah comes. Shenamar, as the pasuk in Hosea says, Achar Yashuvu b'nei Yisrael, that then the Jewish people shall return, Uvikshu es Hashem Elokeihem ve'es David Malkam, and they will seek out the Lord their God and David their king. So I want you to understand, sequentially, what happens first? Does Mashiach come and then we build Yerushalayim? No. First we build Yerushalayim and then Mashiach comes. And that's what we reflect every day in our Shemona Esrei. We say the blessing of Yerushalayim Ircha first, and then we say the bracha of Es Tzemach David. So we're seeing this unfold in our days, right? There's only one little piece of real estate that we just, with a piece of gold over it, that we just gotta take control over, and then everything will be great. The Kevin Sheba David. The camera's on. Yeah, don't worry. I know what I'm saying. The Kevin Sheba David Ba'asa Tefillah. And then once David HaMelech arrives, once Mashiach comes, then we'll be able to have a Beis HaMikdash, because he'll build the Beis HaMikdash for us. And then we'll be able to pray and enter into the temple with prayer. And that's why immediately after Es Tzemach, we go into Shema Koleinu, which is the blessing for prayer. Listen to our voice. Shenamar, as the pasuk says, V'haviosim El Har Kodshi V'simachtim B'veis Tefilasi, that I will bring them to my mount of holiness, and I will rejoice with them in my house of prayer. And then V'keven Shabbos Tefillah B'as Avoda, and then once prayer arrives in the temple, then that's when karbanos are restored. But it's also important to realize that there's a priority placed on prayer even over karbanos. So one should not think that just because we had karbanos, there was no prayer. You see that prayer even precedes karbanos, right? Shenamar, as it says, Olosehem v'zivchehem l'razamol mizbechi, that very same pasuk in Yeshaya that talks about the Beis Tefilasi also says their burnt offerings and their gift offerings shall be accepted on my altar. V'keven shaboas avoda boas atoda. And once we have avoda, we then have which is the bracha of Raizel, obviously. Then we go into thanksgiving, which is either karbanos of thanksgiving and also thanking God verbally for everything that we have. Shenamar zoveach toda yichabdeneni, as the pasuk in Tehillim says, that he who brings a carbon of toda. So in other words, there's a direct correlation, a direct connection between the bringing of karbanos and thanksgiving. So now the Gemara says, okay, fine. So you've got the sequence of Es Tzemach, Shema Koleinu, Raizel, and Modim. We've got all that sequence. Let's go on to the next part. Umara Ulomer Birkas Kohanim Achar Hoda. Why do we say the Birkas Kohanim, Yivarechecha Hashem v'Yishmerecha, after Modim? Dichsiv, as it says, Vayisa Aharon es Yadav el Ha'am, Vayivarechem, Vayered Me'asos Achatas ve'olah ve'hashalomim. Because right after the dedication of the Mishkan, they bring their karbanos. It says that Aaron lifted up his hands and blessed the people, and then he came down from doing the karban chatas and all the other karbanos. So the Gemara says, but how do you understand that pasuk? Ema kodem avoda. Maybe he did this blessing before the sacrifices. Lo sal gedaitach. No, that's not the correct reading. Dichsiv vayered me'asos achatas v'gomer miksiv la'asos me'asos ksiv. It doesn't say that he came down to do the karbanos. He came down from doing the karbanos, which implies that he blessed the people after the karbanos were brought. But the Gemara says, but still you haven't explained. If you're telling me that the Birkas Kohanim comes after karbanos, then maybe we should say V'leimer Achar Havoda. We should say, instead of saying Modim after Raizel, we should say Birkas Kohanim after Raizel. So the Gemara says, Lo salka daitach d'chsiv zoveach toda. But we have that pasuk that we just quoted, which connects karbanos to thanksgiving. So the Gemara says, but wait a minute, my chaz is to samcha sahai smocha hai. But you have two psukim. One connects thanksgiving to karbanos, one connects birkas kohanim to karbanos. Why are you choosing one over the other? The Gemara says, mistavra avoda v'hoda chadamilsihi. The answer is that logic dictates that karbanos and expressions of thanksgiving are of the same genre. They're both expressions of that we, the Jewish people, make to Hashem. Birkas Kohanim is that which the Kohanim bless the Jewish people. So from a thematic point of view, it makes more sense to connect Modim to Ritzei and then put Birkas Kohanim after the two of them. Okay, fine. So that explains why Birkas Kohanim is there. Now let's go on to the last bracha of Shemona Esrei, which is Sim Shalom. Umaro Lomar Sim Shalom Achar Birkas Kohanim. Why does that come after the Birkas Kohanim? Dirsiv V'samu Hashemi al Bnei Yisrael V'ani Avorachem. Because right after Birkas Kohanim is discussed in the Torah in Parshas Naso, it says, "They, the Kohanim, shall place my name on the Jewish people, and I will bless them." Now, what is the ultimate blessing of God? Bracha de'HaKadosh Baruch Hu Shalom. That's peace. Shenamar Hashem Yivarech es Amo v'Shalom. That Hashem will bless His nation with peace, and therefore, it follows that right after Birkas Kohanim, a blessing of peace befalls the Jewish people, and that's why Sim Shalom follows.
Was it a minhag that everyone said Birkas Kohanim at the time in their own Shemona Esrei? Because we don't really do that.
No, it was customary for the Kohanim to bless the people.
While they were doing Shemona Esrei?
During the Chazan's repetition, that's what we do today.
Israel, they do that,
yeah. Or Sephardim do it even outside Eretz Yisrael. Yeah. So now the Gemara says, "V'chi me'achar." I got to Duchim once on my trip to Eretz Yisrael. At least I didn't get to Yerushalayim, but I got to Duchim in Tel Aviv. Okay. V'chi me'achar demeya ve'esrim zekenim u'mehem kam neviim tiknu tefila al haseder Shimon hapakole mai yister. Now, we learned yesterday that there were two statements. One was a sage named Shimon HaPakule who lives in Yavne, either right around the time of the Churban or right after the Churban, organizes the blessings of Shemona Esrei in the presence of Rabbi Gamliel. I think it was Rabbi Gamliel, if I'm not mistaken. And then Rabbi Yochanan had said it was instituted hundreds of years before by the Anshe Knesset Hagdola at the beginning of the Second Temple period. So the Gemara says, please clarify. If it was already established by the Anshe Knesset Hagdola and the Nevi'im at the time, why hundreds of years later was it necessary for Shimon HaPakuli to organize it again? So the Gemara says, Shechachim v'chazar v'sidrum. The answer is that because of whatever inner turmoil that the Jewish people were facing at the time of the Churban, the blessings were forgotten, the order was forgotten, and he came back and he reinstituted it. And now, going back to the sequence of the Shemona Esrei, you're not allowed to institute your own blessings. You cannot add to the Shemona Esrei that Chazal gave us. It's based on this pasuk in Tehillim. Who can enunciate the might of God? Let him make known all of God's praises, which we read as follows: Lami noah lamalal gevuros Hashem, lami sheyachol lahashmiya kol tehilaso. If you're truly capable of expressing all of God's praise, then you have a right to say whatever you want. But we can't express all of God's praise. This is reminiscent of the Gemara in Brachos, which talks about Rabbi was listening to a guy leading the Shemona Esrei, and he said, Hakel, Hagadol, Hagibor, Vehanora, Ve'azuz, Ve'akoyach. He went on and on and on and on for a few minutes, and then when he stopped, Rabbi said, are you done? That's all you can say? You can't praise God more? He says, what you're doing is actually insulting God. It's like if a king deserves to be heaped with gifts of gold and you give him silver, you're insulting the king. It's the same idea over here. Since we lack the vocabulary to properly praise Hashem, like we say in Nishmas, Ilu finu malei shira kayam. Even if our mouths were filled with song like the ocean, we would be inadequate, and therefore you can only use the words that Chazal gave us. Amar Rabbi Bar Barchana, Amar Rabbi Yechanan, Hamasaper b'shvacha shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu yoser midai nekar min ha'olam. In the same vein, if a person speaks of God's praises excessively, he'll be removed from the world. Shenemar hayesupar lo ki adaber im amar ish ki yevula. I think I'm reading it correctly. That if a person wishes to speak about God's praises, if such a person expresses that desire, he will be swallowed up. Darash Reb Yehuda ish kfar giboraya, varmila ish kfar gibor chayil. It's not clear the name of the village, but it sounds like the name of the village was descriptive of the people who lived there. They were mighty people. Mai dichsiv l'cha dumiya tehila. What does the pasuk mean when it says that for you, God, silence is praise? So what does that pasuk mean? It means the pasuk in Tehillim. It's sama dekula mishtoka, that the remedy for everything is silence. In other words, there is no greater medicine for man. Silence is the best medicine. Right? Silence is golden. Or there's another phrase, but there's a phrase in English, I think, about the best medicine is silence, something like that. Ki asa ravdimi amar amr b'marava mila b'sela mishtoka b'train. They say also in the West, in Eretz Yisrael, they say that if a word is worth a selah, silence is worth 2 selahs. In other words, it's always better. Silence is always the best option. Kara al pelo yatsa v'chulei. Now let's go back to our Mishnah. The Mishnah had said that if you recite the Megillah ba'al peh, verbatim, without reading it from a text, you're not yotze. So, Menachem, where do we know this from? Amar Rava asyu zechira cheszichiru. Make a gzeira shava from the word zocher. Ksiv hachavayimim ha'ila nizkarim. It says by the Megillah that the days of Purim are remembered. Uchasiv hasam ksav zosikaron basefer. And when Moshe was speaking to Yoshua after the battle with Amalek, he tells him, write down this as a remembrance in a scroll. Malahalan b'sefer afkan b'sefer. Just like the war with Amalek had to be written down in a scroll, so too Megillah Esther, when it's read, has to be read from a scroll. Dilma iyun ba'oma. But where do you see that there's a requirement of reading of the Megillah? Maybe the word zechira, which means to remember it, just means to think about it. How do you? So fine, write it down in a scroll and just read it without saying the words out loud. How do you know that you have to say the words? Lo salka daitach, the Tanya, but you wouldn't think such a thing because the Brisa says, based on the following pasuk, Zachar, the Torah says, remember what Amalek did to you. Yachol b'leiv, you might think that it's sufficient to remember them in your mind. So kishu omer lo tishkach hareshechas alev amor. The last part of the pasuk says, don't forget. So don't forget already tells me I have to always keep the memory of Amalek alive in my mind. So hamani mekayim zachar. So what does the word zachar mean? Zachar means you have to verbalize it. You have to actually say the words, the story of Amalek. And therefore, similarly, anytime you find the word Zachar in Tanakh, it's a reference to not just remembering it mentally, but also verbalizing it. So you see, this pasuk tells you have to verbalize it, plus you have to verbalize it from a scroll. And that's how we know that you have to read it from inside. Kara targum lo yatsa v'chulei. Then the Mishnah had said that if you recite the Megillah as a translation, either from the Aramaic or any other language, you're not yotze. So the Gemara says, "Hey chidami, what describe what we're talking about? Ilema dekesiva mikra v'kari la targum hainu al peh." The Gemara says, if the Megillah is written in its original Hebrew, and you're just reading a translation, you're reciting a translation, so then obviously you're not going to be yotze because you're reading it ba'al peh. You're not reading from a text. So therefore, why do you need to tell me? We already know the halacha that if you read it ba'al peh, you're not yotze. The Gemara says, Lo tzricha dekasiva targum v'kari la targum. The answer is that let's say you have a Megillah scroll that's all translated into Aramaic, and you read it in Aramaic from the Megillah scroll, that's the chiddush, you're not yotze. Now we saw different opinions. There was an opinion that we saw previously that a Megillah has to dafka be in its original language. But there was another opinion that it doesn't have to be. According to that opinion, that's the chiddush of the Mishnah. But what you are allowed to do, said the Mishnah, this was a little bit puzzling, is you are allowed to read it in a foreign language for someone who understands that foreign language. So that contradicts the immediately preceding statement, which you just told me that if you read it in a foreign language, you're not yotze. So Rav Ushmol Damri to Ravayu Balaz Yavani. So Rav and Shmuel reconcile it by explaining as follows. When the Mishnah says that if you read it in a foreign language, you're Yotzei, it's specifically referring to the Greek language. And if you recall, we saw the opinion of Rav Shimon ben Gamliel, who says that there's a special feature or a special status to the Greek language which puts it on a higher pedestal than all other foreign languages. And therefore, the Mishnah is telling me that if a Megillah is written in Greek and read in Greek, then you'll be Yotzei. So the Gemara says, let's just clarify that. So obviously, one second, you can't be talking about a Megillah that's written in Hebrew and you translate it on the fly into Greek, because that's reading it Baal Peh, and we said you're not Yotzei. So Amar Ravacha, Amar Balazar, Sheksuva Balaz Yavanis. You're right, we're talking about a Megillah scroll that's written in Greek. And there, Rav and Shmuel say that's what our Mishnah means, and they say that you're Yotzei if you read it from a Greek Megillah and you recite it from the Greek Megillah. But Amar Ravacha, Amar Rabbi Lazar, the same two rabbis also said, Minayin Shekaro HaKadosh Baruch Hu Yaakov El. From where do we know that God called Yaakov an El? Now the word El sometimes means God, and sometimes when it's with a lowercase aleph, in a figurative sense, it refers to a mighty being or a mighty force, like Michamocha Ba'elim Hashem. So how do you know that Yaakov was called an El by God? Shenemar Vayikra Lo El Elokei Yisrael. So the pasuk, when you look at the pasuk shot of the pasuk, it talks about Yaakov building a mizbeach, and then it says Vayivin mizbeach Vayikra Lo Kel Elokei Yisrael, that he called it, because Lo means it or it means him. He called it, the altar, Kel Elokei Yisrael, God of Israel. That's the simple explanation. But the Gemara says that's not really what it means. The Ital Kedaitach LaMizbeach Karale Yaakov El. If you're going to think that Yaakov called the Mizbeach El, Vayikra Lo Yaakov Mi Boile, the pasuk should have said that Vayikra Lo Yaakov El, that Yaakov called the Mizbeach El, but it doesn't say that Yaakov called it El. Ela Vayikra Lo Yaakov El, but he called Yaakov El. And who is he? Umikaro El, Elokei Yisrael. Who called Yaakov El? The God of Israel. So Hashem himself called Yaakov an El. So the Gemara now says, Meisvei. Let's go back to the halacha. You're telling me that if it's written in, only if it's written in Greek and read in Greek is what the Mishnah is talking about. Look at the following brisa. Kara agiftis, ivris, ilmis, madis, and yavanis lo yatsa. That if a person reads the Megillah in any foreign language, he's not Yotzei. Now notice that one of the foreign languages that's listed in the brisa is Greek. So you see that Greek is not going to work. So halo damya elolaha. So the Gemara says yes, but the brisa qualifies it and it says, giftis legiftim, ivris leivrim, ilmis leilmim, yavanis leyavanim yatsa. But if you read it in any of these foreign languages for people who understand those languages, then you are going to be Yotzei. So the Gemara says that's why if you read it in Greek, you're Yotzei, because you're reading it in Greek to people who understand Greek, and therefore they're Yotzei. The Gemara now says, but wait a minute. But wait a minute, according to this brisa, it's not limited to the Greek language. As long as the person who's hearing it understands that language, so then he'll be Yotzei. If I read it in English, and I understand English, so then I'll be Yotzei. So why Rav and Shmuel only say it's talking about Greek? So the Gemara says, Ela masnisin kibraisa, v'chi itmar de Rav Shmuel ba'alma itmar. So the Gemara says, you're right. Really, our Mishnah is not saying Rav and Shmuel's statement of Greek. Our Mishnah is going like the Brisa. Our Mishnah first starts off in saying, if you read it in a foreign language, you're not Yotzei. But when is that true? When you don't understand the foreign language. But if you do understand the foreign language, that's the second part of the Mishnah, then you will be Yotzei. If you understand English and you have a Megillah that's written in English on cloth by a scribe that writes the whole Megillah in English, it's bizarre, but if he did it, and then you read that scroll in English, you'd be Yotzei. That's the second part of the Mishnah. So what was Rav and Shmuel, what were they referring to? They disagree with our Mishnah because they go like another Tana. Rav Shmuel, Darmi Teravayu, Laz Yafani La Kol Kasher. They go ahead and they say, not only is Hebrew a good language for everyone, even those who don't understand Hebrew, but even Greek is a fair game language. Even if you don't understand Greek, if you hear the Megillah being read in Greek, you'll also be Yotzei. Frek the Gemara v'haketani Yavanis liyavanim. But what about the Brisa, which says only if you understand Greek will you be Yotze? The Gemara answers liyavanim in l'kuli almalo. Right, so the Gemara answers inu da'amar karabin Shimon Gamliel, because it's a machlokas tanoim. The Rav and Shmuel paskin like Rab Shimon Gamliel da'amar. Ditnan Rab Shimon Gamliel omer af svarm lo hitir sheikasvu ela Yavanis. The Rab Shimon Gamliel says that the Greek language has a special status, and that's why you can write a Sefer Torah in Greek or in Hebrew. In other words, those are the only two languages that you can write a Sefer Torah, because we learned that there's a special intrinsic beauty and a blessing that Noach gave to Yefes, and that's why Greek is special. So the Gemara now says, well, if that's the case, that they're paskening like Rab Shimon Gamliel, v'leimru halacha Rab Shimon Gamliel. Why didn't they just say, we pasken like Rab Shimon Gamliel? Why do they have to sort of innovate and say the halacha as if it's their own? The Gemara answers, I amri halacha Rab Shimon Gamliel havamina hani mili shar svarim, avol Megillah dichsiv ba kichsavam emalo kamash malon. So we had seen this Gemara before. This Gemara says, because you might have thought that the Megillah is different from a Sefer Torah. A Sefer Torah you can write in Greek according to Shimon Gamliel, fine, because of the intrinsic beauty of the Greek language. But in the Megillah Esther, it says it has to be performed the way that it's written. And therefore the way that it's written, kichsavam, it might imply, you might think that Rabbi Shimon Gamliel would agree that a Megillah can only be written in Hebrew, and therefore Rav and Shmuel have to make a point of telling you, no, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel would hold not only can a Sefer Torah be written in Greek, but even a Megillah can be written and read in Greek. Yeah.
If the Greek language was considered so chashuv, why were the rabbis so upset when they got to that dilemma where they were all in different rooms? Then they have to translate for the religion.
Okay, all right. So that's a very good question. It's a very good question. They were upset because the Torah was being revealed to the outside world. It's a chem de genuza. The Gemara calls the Torah a hidden treasure. And when you have a hidden treasure, and you're now exposing it, you're cheapening it in some way by making it accessible to the rest of the world. That was the sentiment that the rabbis had.
In other words, if they had written it just for themselves, they wouldn't have been so upset.
Yeah, they're right. The reason why this was considered a tragic day was because it was being exposed now to the rest of the world. Correct.
Why is our Hebrew today called Ashuri, but the Ivrit, Rashi explains, is Lashon Ever HaNahar?
Right, because there is an ancient Hebrew. When you look at the archaeological digs, and you see that the original language of Canaan was Ivri, because that was the Middle Eastern language of the time before Ashurit, before the Assyrian script came into being.
So why is our Hebrew called Ashurit?
Well, our Hebrew is called Ashurit because historically it comes afterwards. It comes from the Assyrian. Avraham, that's where Avraham Avinu comes from. Avraham Avinu is only called in Hebrew because he comes from looking at it from the perspective of those who were living in Canaan. He comes from the other side of the Nahar, right? But Assyrian is the real, Ashuris is the real Hebrew language. That the way the Rambam understands, that was the original Hebrew. Then it was replaced when the Canaanim came into the land with what the Gemara calls Zivri, and then when we retook it, we reinstituted the original language of.
So what's this Zivri that's Lashon Ever HaNahar then? It's a different language.
It seems it's a Semitic language. It's probably Ugaric or one of the other ancient Semitic languages of the Middle East. Okay. V'haloes sheshama ashuris yatsa. The next thing that we learned is that if a person is a foreigner and he doesn't understand Hebrew, if he hears the Megillah being read in Hebrew, he is Yotze. So the Gemara says, V'halo yada maika amri. But how can he be Yotze if he doesn't know what the words mean? So the Gemara says, what's the big deal? Mida dahava anoshim ve'amei haaretz. He'll be no different from women in ignoramuses. Now, the point that the Gemara is making is that you don't have to be literate in order to be Yotzei a mitzvah. And the Gemara, therefore, basically says it's not the optimal way if you don't understand Hebrew, but you see that segments of the Jewish population can be Yotzei this way. So the Gemara is basically saying he's a less than optimal kind of person, just like women and ignoramuses. Now, this is not misogyny on behalf of the Gemara. The historical record will show that women were not educated. in the times of the Gemara. They didn't have scholastic systems set up for women. This is part of modern Jewish history from Sarah Schneer and onwards, or at least in the way that it's been organized in the modern world. So it's not that women are less intelligent, it just means that for whatever reason they were less educated than men were at this time when this is being written. So the Gemara now says, Maskef lo Ravina, atu anan ha'achash teranim b'nei haramochim miyadinan. So Ravina is very unhappy with this explanation. He says, why are you telling me that this person will be like an Am Haaretz because he doesn't understand Hebrew? We who understand Hebrew, we the sages, also there are words that we don't understand. There are certain terms that appear in Megillah Esther that are descriptive of official government positions in the Persian government that we don't even understand what these people did. Like, for example, Achash Teranim and B'nei Haramochim. We don't understand what these stations were in Persian government of the ancient world, and yet we read them anyway. So there are plenty of words that even great rabbis don't understand correctly. Elo mitzvahs kriyo persumei nisa, hachanami mitzvahs kriyo persumei nisa. So the answer is that the whole idea behind reading the Megillah, even when you don't understand the words, is that through the public reading of the Megillah, you'll sit down afterwards and have a discussion with your friends and talk about the story. That's the objective. And that's why, even when you hear the Megillah and you don't understand all the words, you're still Yotzei the mitzvah of Pirsumei Nusa by publicizing the miracle and gathering together for the sake of discussing the story. Kara Seiragin Yatsa B'chulei. Then the Mishnah had said that if you read it intermittently, well, like I said, you go for a coffee break after the first chapter before you read the second chapter, you'll still be Yotzei. So the Gemara now gives us an interlude, which Gemara we saw in Rosh Hashanah as well. Ohavu Yadi Rabbanan Mai Seiragin. The rabbis didn't know that in the post-Mishnaic period, didn't know what Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi meant when he used the word Seiragin. They were just unfamiliar with the word, which we translated it as intermittent. So Shamua la'amsa devei Rabbi de ka'amar lehu l'Rabbanan dahavu aili piski levei Rabbi ad mosai atem nichnasim Seiragin. So one day the rabbis heard Rebbe's handmaid, who was very well versed in Rebbe's vocabulary. So she noticed one day that the Talmidim were coming into the Beis Medrash like in small little groups, like 2 guys would come in and then 5 minutes later another 3 guys would come in. And she said, why are you coming in Seirugin? Which means in piecemeal fashion. So therefore, they understood that the word Seirugin means if you read it in piecemeal fashion without reading it straight through. Lo habu yadi rabbanan mai chalug logos. Shamua la'ams devei Rebbe da'amr le'lahu gavra da'hava kamavader par pichine ad masayatem efazer chalag lugecha. Another similar story. The Mishnah mentions a certain kind of vegetation called chalug lugos. And the rabbis didn't know what kind of vegetable that was. They once heard Rebbe's handmaid saying to a man who was scattering this kind of leafy vegetable, which was known, called parpichine, and she said, why are you scattering your chalug logos? So then they understood what Rebbe meant when he used that word. Lo havu yadi rabbanan my salsalo saromemecha. Another example is that this now goes to biblical text. The rabbis didn't know what the words mean when it says in Mishlei, it says salsala, do something to the Torah and it will raise you up. So what does that word salsala mean? So Shamua la'amsu devei Rebbe dahavas amras lahu gavra dava mahapich b'mazye amrlei ad masayatem mesalsal b'sarecha. But then they saw Rebbe's handmaid once looking at a guy who was playing with his payas. He was twisting his hair, right? So she said, like you go on the subway in Manhattan, you see that sometimes, right? Or the bus in Israel. So she said to him, why are you being misalsel with your hair? So then they understood it means to twist it or turn it around or get entangled in it. And therefore what it means is that enter into an entanglement with the Torah and twist it and go through it carefully, and then it'll raise you up.
These are Hebrew words.
Well, the fact that it's in the Tanakh means that it is a Hebrew word. So you see that there are certain Hebrew texts that Chazal still don't know the meaning, translation of the word.
Were they Goyim?
No, she was probably Jewish. She could have been Jewish, but the point is that she lived in Rebbe's house. So she heard Rebbe talking about these things all the time. She was a Talmud Chacham because she was around the rabbi for all the time. Right? Lo havuyat, like Salim's girl who speaks Hebrew. Lo havuyadi rabbanan, my hashlech al Hashem yahavchavu. So the rabbis also didn't know what it means when it says in Tehillim, thrust upon God your yahav. So what does that mean? It's a noun. We don't know what that noun means. Amar Rabba bar Barchana zimna chada hava azilna bahadi hahutaya. Once I was walking behind an Arab, v'ka darina tuna, and I was schlepping a load on my back. V'amar li shkol yahaveich v'shadei agamloi. And the Arab said to me, he said, here, don't schlep that load on your back. And he called that load on my back, he called it a yahav. He said, put it on my camel instead. So then we know that the word yahavcha means your burden. Thrust upon God your burden and He'll take care of you, which is a beautiful idea, which is why we say it, some people say it in their davening every day. It's a pasuk that says basically, you got problems, you got a pekel that you're schlepping around, put it on God. Say, God, you take care of it, and Hashem will release you from that burden. Lo havuyadi rabbanan mai v'ta'atasiya b'mitatei hashemad. The rabbis didn't know the meaning of a pasuk in Yeshaya that says that I shall be mitatei with the mitate of destruction. So it's talking about some kind of destructive act. But what is the word mitate, which is used both as a verb and a noun? So Shamu la'amsu devei Rebbe dahabes amr lechaverta shkole ta'atisa v'tati besa. So they once saw Rebbe's handmaid telling one of her younger colleagues, take that broom and sweep. And she used the exact same verbiage. So then they knew that it means that God says, I will sweep it out with the broom of destruction. Tana Rabbanan. Kara seirigin yatsa, seirusin lo yatsa. So the Brisa now says that if you read the Megillah intermittently, that's fine. But if you read it in out of order, which is what lisares means to invert it, so then you're not yotze. Rabbi Muna Omer Mishum Rabbi Yehuda Af B'Seirugin Imshah Kedei Ligmor Eskula Chozer L'Rosh. So Rabbi Yehuda has a chumrah, and that chumrah is that even though we said if you read it intermittently you're yotze, however, if the coffee break that you take between Perek Aleph and Perek Beis is so long that you could read the entire Megillah during that pause, so then you're not yotze. You have to go back to the beginning. Amar Rav Yosef halacha k'Rav Muna shama mishum Rabbi Yehuda. And Rav Yosef says that's taka how we paskin. You have to be machmir like that shita. Amar le'Abai leRav Yosef k'dei ligmor eskula mehecha dekayi l'seifa o dilma meireisha l'seifa. So Abaye says, please clarify, Rav Yosef, what Rabbi Yehuda meant when he says that the pause is the time that it takes you to read the Megillah. Does it mean the time that it takes you to finish the Megillah from that point where you stopped? Meaning, let's say you took a break between Perek Aleph and Perek Beis. So does that mean that if the time that you pause, the time that it takes you to read from Perek Beis till the end? Or is it the time that it takes you to read the entire Megillah from beginning to end is where it becomes a problem? So Amarlei Meireisha L'Seifa Dimkeno Sata Divarecha L'Shiurin. So Rav Yosef says no matter where you stop, it's always the same amount of time, the time that it takes you to read the entire Megillah. Because if you were going to say the alternative, then if you stop between Perek Aleph and Beis, then it's a longer time. If you stop between Perek Zayin and Perek Ches, then it's a shorter time, because then you would have a much less of the Megillah to finish. And therefore there's an inconsistency with the time lag that we're discussing, depending upon where you're positioned. And that seems to be inconsistent with the ways that the Chachamim normally institute takanas, which is that there's a set time amount for a certain psul or for a certain halacha. So therefore, the logic dictates that it's got to be a specific amount of pausing, no matter where you pause in the Megillah. Amar Rabbi Abba, Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba, Amar Rav halacha ka Rabbi Muna, Ushmol Amar ein halacha ka Rabbi Muna. So Rabbi Abba, in the name of Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba, says that the halacha is like Rabbi Muna, quoting Rabbi Yehuda, who says that if you pause for the amount of time it takes to read the whole thing, you're not yotze. And Shmuel says, no, we're not machmir like that. And you can pause as long as you want, the whole day, and you'll still be yotze. Besura masnuhachi, bepumpadisa masnuhachi. Surah had given the attribution to Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba, but in Pumpadisa they said no, it's to Rav Kahana. Amar Rav Kahana, Amar Rav halacha ka Reb Muna, Shmuel Amar ein halacha ka Rabbi Muna. Same machlokas though between Rav and Shmuel. Rav Bibi masni ibcha, but Rav Bibi inverts the machlokas. He says no, Shmuel is the machmir and Rav is the mekel. Rav Amar ein halacha karebi Muna, u'Shmuel Amar halacha karebi Muna. So Amar Rav Yosef, Nakota Rav Bibi biyadcha, d'Shmuel hu d'chayish liyichida. I'll prove to you that that's the correct way of learning the machlokas, that Shmuel is the machmir and Rav is the mekel. And I'll prove it to you. You know why? Because Shmuel, in general, will be choshesh, will fear the singular opinion to be machmir. Whereas Rav, normally when he sees that the rabbis in the majority are mekel, he won't worry about the minority opinion that's machmir. But Shmuel does. And I'll give you an example. Ditnan shomeres yavam shekidesh achiv esachosa mishum Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira amru omrim lo hamtenat sheyase achicha gadol ma'aseh and Amar Shmuel halacha k'Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira. The story is like this: there's a case over there where the chachamim are mekel, Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira is machmir, and Shmuel is machmir like Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira, even though he's a yachid. So that's illustrative of what we just were trying to present. The case has to do with yibum. So very briefly, because we're going to learn yivamos after we finish Seder Moed, is that the case of Yibum is that if a woman falls to Yibum, meaning that her husband died without children, and now her brother, there is a group of brothers, the oldest brother has the mitzvah of doing Yibum. But if the other brothers do Yibum, they also fulfill the mitzvah, even though the first rights of refusal are for the oldest brother to do that mitzvah of Yibum. Now, what if the woman who falls to Yibum has sisters? So, if one of the younger brothers presents one of the sister of the Yavama with Kiddushin, then according to the Chachamim, halachically she's married, because the fact that the sister falls for Yibum and the other brothers are sort of somewhat connected to her does not preclude them from marrying a sister of that Yavama. But Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira says, no, it does preclude them until the other brother does Yibum. So let the oldest brother do Yibum, and only afterwards can one of the other brothers marry the sister of the Yavama. But until the oldest brother does Yibum, the other brothers do not have a right to consummate a marriage with the sister of the Yavama because of this sort of pseudo connection that applies to all of the brothers until one brother does Yibum. But in any event, Shmuel says we have to be choshesh to that opinion, and therefore the brother who presented the sister with Kiddushin cannot consummate the marriage until the older brother does Yibum. Tana Rabbana. Let's now look at the Brisa. Hishmit basofer osios obsukim v'karin hakori kimiturgam amatargem yatsa. We'll learn like Rashi here, which says as follows. If you have a sofer who wrote a Megillah, and he leaves out letters, words, or entire psukim, as long as you read the entire Megillah, even though you have to read those parts that he left out, ba'al peh, you'll be yotzei. So the Gemara says, Meisvei, hayu ba'osios metushtashos o mekuraos im rishuma nikr kesherav im lav besula. The Brisa seems to contradict that, because the Brisa says that if a Megillah is written with words or letters that have been worn out or torn out, so then you're not yotze with that Megillah. So how do you reconcile it? So the Gemara says, Lo kasha habakula habamiktsasa. The answer is that the Bryce is talking about where the entire Megillah has worn out letters. If the letters are not legible throughout the Megillah, then you're not yotze. But what we're talking about is where the majority of the Megillah is legible and is written properly, and a minority of it is not written properly. And by the way, you should know that's how we paskin. That even though a Sefer Torah, if it's missing even one letter, is puzzle, a Megillah can have many letters missing and it'll still be kosher. And that's why, from a practical standpoint, when you're learning to be a sofer, what's the first thing you write? You write a Megillas Esther, because if you mess up, it's still kosher, right? That's why. So that when you're just getting to know the art, it's not. So you'll make a few mistakes. Nishkaferlach, it'll still be a kosher Megillah.
Didn't we say before we can't learn from memory the Megillah? So
yeah, but here, the majority, since you're learning the majority from the Ksav, it's okay to learn a minority of the letters or words ba'al peh. Tana Rabbanan. Hishmit ba hakore pasuk echad lo yomer ekra es kula ve'achach ekra oso pasuk elakor me oso pasuk ve'elach. That the Brisa says that if a person who's reading it left out a pasuk by accident, he skips a pasuk, he shouldn't say, okay, I'll finish reading it and then I'll make up the pasuk at the end, because that's reading it out of order. But rather he's got to go back to the pasuk that he forgot, and then he reads from that point onwards. 1986. Tainus Esther. Rav Moshe Feinstein's Levaya. So we were all in the yeshiva in Baltimore, and we attended the Levaya. We get back 10, 11 o'clock at night. We haven't heard the Megillah yet. We get back to Baltimore, and one of the Rosh Yeshiva, we're all exhausted. He reads the Megillah and left out a word, and we were all so exhausted. No one, hundreds of guys in the basement, no one caught it. One person caught it after he finished the Megillah. We had to go hear the Megillah all over again. Well, anyway.
You had a lot of friends.
Yeah. So they did a whole Purim spiel about the guy the following year. Nichnas lebeis hakneses umatzat tzibur shekaru chetzah lo yomer ekra chetzi mat tzibur v'ekra chetzia elakari osa mitchilas v'yat sofa. Another halacha similar to this is that if a person walks in late to the reading of the Megillah, which happens every year, all the time, with tons of people, they don't know this halacha. Guy walks in, they've already started the Megillah. You can't say, okay, I'll finish hearing whatever the tzibur is reading, and then I'll make up the first part afterwards. Doesn't work that way. If you miss even the first word, you can't continue. You have to read yourself and catch up. Misnamnem yatsa. The next part we learned in the Mishnah that if a person is in a dozing state, he's still yotze. So what does that mean to be in a dozing state? So heichidami misnamnem amar ravashi nim velo nim tir velo tir. It means that you're sleeping and you're not sleeping, you're awake and you're not awake, which means you're in a quasi sleep state.
It's regular for most people.
Yeah. It means that you call out to a person and he can respond, but not intelligently. In other words, you can't have intelligent conversation. You just say like, Yankel, yeah. Yeah. And then you remind him, do you remember I was calling out to you? He'll say yes, but I don't remember. In other words, it's that semi-sleep state that my kids are in the morning. Okay. If a person, then we said in the Mishnah, if he's writing the Megillah, or if he's giving a sermon, or a lecture, or he's reading a Megillah to see if there's any mistakes in it, and while he's doing that, he's saying the words out loud of the entire Megillah, as long as he has kavanah to be Yotzei, the mitzvah is Yotzei, but if he doesn't have kavanah, then he's not Yotzei. So, heichi dami. So the Gemara says, let's talk about this guy who's writing a Megillah, and he's reading the words while he's writing. So, ita kamisader psuka v'kasav laki kivin lo b'may habi al pehu. The Gemara says, I don't understand. If he says the word vayehi, and then he writes the word vayehi, then he says the word bimei, he writes the word bimei, he's not going to be yotzei. He's saying it ba'al peh. So the Gemara says, Ela dekasa psuka v'karilei. So the alternative is that he writes the word vayehi, and then he says the word vayehi. So he's reading it from inside a Megillah. But the Gemara says, but that's still not going to work. Umi yatsa v'ha'amar Rabbi Chelba amar Rav Chama bar Guria amar Rav halacha kedivrei ha'omer kula v'afilu l'man darma me'ish Yehudi tzricha shtei ksuva kula. There's a machlokes that we've seen as to at what point must you start reading the Megillah in order to be yotzei. So the opinion that we paskin like is from Vayihi b'mei Achashverosh, the very beginning. But there's another opinion that says you can start from the end of Perek Beis of Ish Yehudi Haya b'Shushan Habira, right? That's the main part of the story. But either way, both opinions agree that you have to read from a fully written Megillah that starts from the very beginning and goes to the very end. So this guy who's in the middle of writing a Megillah, even though he's reading it as the words are being written, but you don't have a full Megillah in front of you, so how can you be Yotzei? So Ela demancha Megillah kamei v'korile mina psuka v'kasavla. So here's what we're talking about. We're talking about a transcriber. He's got two sets of parchment. One is a fully written Megillah on his right side, and on his left side is empty cloth that he's writing from. And he's copying from this Megillah and writing in this Megillah. So he reads in the fully written Megillah Vayehi, he writes down Vayehi, Bimei, he writes down Bimei. So in that way he can be Yotze because he's reading the words from a fully written Megillah. So the Gemara... That's normally the way you do it, but technically, the Gemara is going to suggest that perhaps, well, we'll see. You'll see in just a second. Lema misayei leila Rabba bar bar Chana. Dama Rabba bar bar Chana arma b'Yochanan. Asur lichtov os echa shalom min haksav. Rabba bar bar Chana says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, you're not allowed to write holy scriptures unless you're transcribing from an already extant text. You can't just remember the words ba'al peh. So this seems to support that opinion. So the Gemara says, no, not necessarily. Dilma de Isrami le Yisramuye. You can't prove from here that you're obligated to do it that way. Maybe it just so happens that you happen to have a fully written Megillah that you're transcribing from, but it doesn't. The Mishnah is not telling you that you have to do it that way. Gufa, let's go back to that halacha. Amar Rabbi Bar Chana Rabbi Yechanan Asa lichta vos echa shlomin aksav. That when you write Holy Scriptures, you have to transcribe it. You can't be writing it just from memory. So the Gemara says, Meisvei, Amar Reb Shimon ben Elazar, Ma'isa Reb Meir shalach le'aber shana ba'asya, v'lo haya sham Megillah, v'kasva milibo v'kara. There was once a story where Reb Meir traveled to where the Sanhedrin was temporarily located in order to be able to declare an extra month of Adar. And while he was there over Purim, and there was no Megillah to read from. So what did he do? He took cloth and he wrote a brand new Megillah and he read from it. And so you see, what do you see from here? You see that you can write Holy Scripture Ba'al Peh without transcribing. So Amar Rabavahu Shiny Rabbi Meir Dimikayim Bey Va'afapecha Yayashiru Negdecha. Reb Meir is an exception. You know why? Because it says your eyelids will be organized in front of you, which means that he had a photographic memory. He could just close his eyes and see the text of the Megillah in front of his eyes. So the Gemara says, Amar le Rami bar Chama le Rabbi Yirmiyah midifti mai va'afapecha yashu negdecha. What does that pasuk mean? Amar lo elu divrei Torah dichsiv behu hisif einecha bo ve'einenu. This refers to, when it says va'afapecha, it's a reference to the words of Torah, because the Torah is something where if you just close your eyes for a minute, the words of Torah will disappear. Now what that means is, it's a very profound statement, just very briefly, it means that the words of Torah are otherworldly. And because they're otherworldly, they're very easily lost from the human mind. You can just, even if you just interrupt your thoughts even for a moment from words of Torah, they're easily forgotten because they're of a different realm. And therefore you have to always keep your eye focused on words of Torah so that you don't forget them. But Reb Meir was an exceptional human being. He was part of that other realm in his entire being. And therefore he was able to retain them from a photographic memory. And that's what the Gemara says, that Reb Meir was exceptional. The Gemara now relates the story of much later, that Rav Chisda once finds Rav Hananel writing scriptures Ba'al Peh, not transcribing them from an existent text. So Amar Lei Re'uya Kol HaTorah Kula Likasev Al Picha Elakach Amru Chachamim Asu Lichta Vosecha Shlom Min Aksav. He chastises gently Rav Hananel. He says, "Listen, Rav Hananel, you're a great Talmud Chacham. The Torah could be written through your memory alone, but nevertheless, you're still obligated to only transcribe. You can't write the words Ba'al Peh." So we see the praise that Rav Chisda gave to Rav Hananel indicates that he also had a photographic memory like Rabbi Meir. Reb Meir kasav. So why then was it okay for Rabbi Meir, who had a photographic memory, to write it Ba'al Peh, but it wasn't okay for Rav Hananel, who had the same photographic memory, to write it Ba'al Peh? So the Gemara answers, Shasa dechak shayni. It's because there was no other option. Reb Meir had no other option. There was no other Megillah available. But what Rav Chisda was chastising Rav Hananel was, you have other Megillahs available. You shouldn't be writing a Megillah Ba'al Peh. You should be transcribing it, even though you have a photographic memory. So Abaya Shara lo devei barchabo lemichtav tefillin mezuzah shlom in aksav. Then the Gemara says that Abaya permitted a certain group of scribes called the house of Barchabo. He permitted them, when they wrote tefillin and mezuzahs, they didn't have to transcribe them from existing texts. Kiman ki haitana detanya. This goes according to the following brisa. Rabbi Yirmiyah Omer Mishum Rabbeinu tefillin and mezuzahs nichtava shlom in aksav ein tzricha sirtut. That tefillin and mezuzahs, which are just smaller pieces of cloth, they can be written Ba'al Peh, and furthermore, you don't have to have the lines in them like you do have in the Sefer Torah.